Welcome everyone to our first fireside chat of our data diplomacy series through the National Science Policy Network, also known as NSPN. We're thrilled to continue our conversation on data diplomacy, and I'm especially excited to have some great speakers with us today who will be diving into diplomacy for data, which means they'll be sharing with us their professional work and insights on data governance. And if you're not familiar with NSPN, NSPN is an organization designed for and geared for early career STEM professionals who wish to engage and train in science advocacy, policy, and diplomacy. So we welcome you to connect with us if you wish to learn more about NSPN or today's event. All right, so I'd like to start by introducing the team behind the making of this event. I would first like to thank our co-sponsor, Duke University's Rethinking Diplomacy program, for amplifying data diplomacy through their research. And then I would like to introduce the science diplomacy team at NSPN behind this series. I'm Anastasia Burnett. I'm a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where I analyze and build data tools across energy and environmental fields, and I will be today's moderator. We also have Ona Ambarzeta, who is the chair of NSPN Science Diplomacy Committee. And then we have Matt Contursi, who is a JD candidate at the University of California Davis School of Law. And finally, Abigail Giles, who's a PhD candidate in the medical sciences at the University of Cambridge. This team was behind this event's early development and its ongoing support. And I would like to really especially thank Ona and Abigail for all their insights on science diplomacy. So today's event will be a rich slice in a larger conversation on data diplomacy. And our goal through this series is really to bring attention to and contextualize the emerging field of data diplomacy using real-world examples. So far, we've launched our series with an introduction and keynotes to data diplomacy, and now we're diving into our specific themes. These themes are diplomacy for data, then data in diplomacy, and then finally data for diplomacy. For today's event, we'll be exploring diplomacy for data, or in other words, how data governance and user agreements are used to navigate international and domestic affairs. And because I'm extremely curious to hear what our speakers are going to say, I will only briefly introduce what diplomacy for data is and why it is important. And then we'll turn straight over to professional introductions and a discussion between John Verwey, Hannah Bracken, and Elma Heinrich. So what is diplomacy for data and why does it matter? Diplomacy for data is a thematic slice in our larger framework about data diplomacy, and it represents the diplomatic decisions surrounding data use and governance. On the circular petals to the left, you'll see examples of diplomacy for data, which some of you will hear about today, such as the application of EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or also known as GDPR, which has deeply shaped the political narrative and governance of cross-country data flows. And diplomacy for data is important because data can't be readily divorced from our assigned economies, cultures, and science and governance. As a result, data can really be the source of socioeconomic and geopolitical power, but diplomacy for data can help prevent harms and promote novel political solutions to emerging issues in an increasingly global and technological world. So on that note, I welcome our speakers for today. We'll engage in a set of questions on this exciting topic up until 5 minutes till the hour. Then we'll briefly open up for questions from the audience. And because we wanted our speakers to be secure in their answers, we've allowed speakers to come prepared with their thoughts, but we also encourage any speaker who feels inspired by the conversation to respond to their co-speakers where they see fit by raising their hand. Also, with such little time given to the audience for questions, I deeply encourage members to reach out to the speakers after the event for additional questions. So with that, I'm excited to briefly introduce our speakers and then let them take the stage. So today you will hear from John Verwey, Hannah Bracken, and Elma Heinrich. John Verwey is an East Asia National Security Advisor at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. In his role, he uses his background in strategic trade controls and US-China technology assessments to support US government export control, supply chain security, and non-proliferation missions. He is also a contributing author to Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology and has worked for the US Department of Commerce and for 2 federal US trade agencies. He also holds a graduate degree in international political economy from the London School of Economics. Next, we'll have Hannah Bracken. Hannah is a policy advisor focused on data flows between the European Union and the United States in the US DOC's Privacy Shield team. Hannah previously worked on digital policy at the US mission to the European Union in Brussels, and before that worked on cybersecurity policy at Poulin International. Hannah received her master's degree from Sciences Po in Paris and also worked as a trainee lawyer in Paris for a year. Finally, we have Elma Heinrich, who is a PhD student in the Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology program at the School for the Future of Innovation at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on critical data studies of emerging technologies, centering data, governance, surveillance, and privacy. She's also an NSF Fellow in the National Research Traineeship on Citizen-Centered Smart Cities and Smart Living, and is a Haystack Scholar. And Elma holds a master's degree in Science and Technology Policy. So thank you all so much for being here today. And I'm going to open it up for you all to share your introductions. So I'll go in the same order and let John start us off with his introductions.
Sure. Thanks for the kind introduction, Anastasia. So as she mentioned, I work at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and a large part of my work for PNNL focuses on supply chain security and supply chain risk management. So I think the original reason for me being a part of this panel was last year I gave a testimony before a commission of Congress on US government efforts to review and manage supply chains. And that's kind of the context in which I'll be talking about data availability, data paucity, and traceability, because that's the area that I spend most of my time thinking about right now. As you have no doubt noticed in the headlines, everyone's talking about supply chain security these days, but no one does a very good job defining what that means. And defining what it means is actually a very important step in understanding what sort of data resources are available or frankly not available when you're trying to establish the security or lack thereof of a supply chain. So the government spent quite a bit of time working on this, and there was an executive order in January of last year, I believe, or maybe 2 years ago at this point, EO 14017, which mandated a series of executive branch reviews of critical technology supply chains. So this was the Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Agriculture, all the way to Department of Energy and Department of Defense. And they were all looking at different supply chains, and in particular, using data-driven approaches to map those supply chains. So there are kind of two different aspects to data and supply chains that I'll speak to very briefly, and then I'm actually going to hand it over because I don't want to take too much time. But you can use data on supply chains, which takes the form of international trade information, so imports and exports, as a proxy for supply chain dependence. So you can look at, for example, US imports of a particular commodity from another country as a percent of overall US imports from the world for that commodity to determine import dependence. So for a country like Malaysia that exports a lot of integrated circuits to the United States, what you can do is figure out very quickly what percent of overall US imports of integrated circuits come from Malaysia, and use that to characterize the supply chain dependency. And in some cases where the number is very high, hypothetically, some sort of commodity where the US is 100% import dependent on a particular country for a commodity, that's the sort of choke point that you can use data to identify, and then ideally go down the path of mitigating it. The other type of information that's frequently used in supply chain analyses that's more of a data-driven approach is frankly owned by the private sector, because supply chains consist of private companies engaged in private transactions that are typically business to business and occasionally business to consumer. So you have to use a lot of data resources that are sort of outside of mainstream accessibility. So there's a lot of commercially sourced supply chain information where aggregators will go through and scrape lists of company facilities and manufacturing locations and to determine the provenance of goods, or look at where a product begins as a raw material, becomes a processed material, then becomes integrated as a subcomponent, and then a component, and then into a finished assembly. And that information is generally owned by the private sector companies that are involved in those stages, but aggregated by third-party commercial vendors who then sell that information to other entities that want to engage in supply chain risk management. So that's kind of my high-level overview. And I will stop there and hand it over to, if we're going in order, I think Hannah will be next.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really fascinating, especially the choke point mention. But yeah, go for it, Hannah.
Thanks so much, and it's just really great to be with this group of scientists and engineers today. So, thank you for the opportunity, because I'm so aware that you all are using data for good in many ways. And my first job out of my undergraduate degree was working for an academic publisher in the sciences, and that experience left me in awe of the work that you do and the very prolific way that you share it. Just as a quick background about me and where I'm coming from on these topics, after my time in publishing, I studied law in Paris, and that was while the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, was entering into force. So in one class, we considered the uncharted territory for compliance with the GDPR, and this is, of course, applicable in the EU and extraterritorially for public sector, private sector organizations, and also nonprofits. So now that academic experience that I had, and often those same questions, factor into my work for the International Trade Administration. So the International Trade Administration is part of the Department of Commerce, and ITA strengthens the competitiveness of US industry. It has a role promoting trade and investment, and it ensures fair trade through enforcement of our trade laws and agreements. And with our interagency counterparts, we do diplomacy work to promote international data flows that are so critical for research, among other things. I'm on a Europe-focused team, as was previously mentioned, and that makes sense, and I appreciate that given my personal background and experience in Europe. But just so that you know, I have colleagues who work on issues at the intersection of trade, national security, and privacy law globally as well. So we're by no means solely focused on the European Union. And we administer a program that was designed to give US companies a stable legal basis to receive EU personal data in compliance with EU law, including the GDPR. US organizations and multinationals with activities in the US will be able to use this program as the basis for their commercial data transfers after the European Commission finalizes a draft adequacy decision that it has relative to the program. And this program is called the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. The transatlantic work that we're doing with our European counterparts facilitates these transfers for the benefit of both US and EU companies. So I think this is a key point just at the outset of the conversation, that there's not a zero-sum game in terms of data, and the actions that we as governments can take to facilitate trade and research can serve both our local companies and those companies from our strategic partner nations at the same time. European companies want to be able to transfer EU personal data as well, and they might transfer it to the US, for instance, if they have US operations to manage. So data is just more useful when it's not siloed. And just to close my kind of intro, I'm talking about companies and commercial data flows. So this is particularly applicable for research that's taking place within the private sector, specifically within organizations that are subject to the Federal Trade Commission or the US Department of Transportation. But the underlying issues are, of course, applicable for nonprofit and public sector use, storage, and movement of data. And so I have colleagues at the National Institutes of Health, among others, who are experts in that arena and that we work with. Thanks.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to meet you and hear about your work. So I guess finally we'll turn to Elma for her introduction.
Thanks for the very generous introduction already. I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to the discussions. I think the other panelists here have very robust and rich experience directly working with policy. I am a third-year PhD student in the human and social dimensions of science and technology at ASU. And I think my approach to data governance is a bit removed being a PhD student, but I did have experience interning at GAO on their science and technology assessment and analytics team looking at 5G and facial recognition. That's my direct policy experience, but otherwise my research is really looking at data from a critical data studies perspective and identifying some of the gaps and some of the opportunities where we have to enrich our approaches to data governance. For example, I see a lot looking at privacy specifically in a lot of clauses that address personally identifiable data. But my research is kind of scoping it out a little bit more to start thinking about surveillance ecosystems and some of the experiences that people have who are subjected to these emerging technologies who might not have consented to them, and just digging into that scope. I'm also part of the NSF NRT on citizen-centered science, citizen-centered smart cities and smart living. So my interest in data governance falls specifically into that smart cities framework. And that's also where I see a lot of gaps and a lot of opportunity for more governance, even though the direction there is heading towards less and less governance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elma, and also great to meet you. And thanks again for everyone sharing their backgrounds with us. It's really compelling to hear from each of you. So now I'm really excited to finally dive into some questions. I'm going to ask 4 questions and maybe a 5th one if there is time. So I'm going to start with a question that I thought would help set the ground about what are some of the challenges and opportunities you're facing in your work. And so I want to ask, data governance often considers the need for accessible, interoperable, and secure data. How would you describe the role that data governance and or data diplomacy plays in your work? What progress have you seen on those fronts, and where is there legal friction? And I'll direct this question in reverse order, starting with Elma.
Sure. So I mentioned a little bit about the smart city approaches being more and more towards kind of these innovation districts that tend to be hands-off governance and even local governance, kind of allowing this test zone and this sandbox that allows for innovation. And I think there is a very large challenge between balancing that innovation mindset and protecting privacy and protecting data and kind of thinking about the surveillance ecosystem again. Different locations have had different approaches, and we've seen some locations have very large failures, like the Sidewalk Labs in Toronto was a very big failure in part because of their lack of attention towards data security and data governance. So there are lessons learned and things that set the stage there. Also thinking about cybersecurity as an aftermath is often a problem in these spaces. There's a lot of legal friction between emerging technologies and trying to do data. So I hope that answers the question for now.
Yeah, that's great. Especially, I never considered much about cybersecurity post maybe disaster in the data world, which I could see that. I think there's maybe in my work a lot more effort to do it after maybe some bad experiences of post. So yeah, thank you. Hannah, I'll direct this towards you too now.
Thanks. It's a really interesting question, and the international cooperation aspect of data governance is at the core of my work and professional experience. And I've found that clear definitions are key in having a kind of baseline understanding of what's being discussed. It sounds really basic, but it's also essential for live discussions in policy meetings, particularly the case in international settings. And so an example of this is like the concept of personal data, which is important in research and commercial contexts, particularly for the ability of personal data to move and be accessed by different parties in compliance with privacy laws. But it can be hard to fully define personal data on a national, regional, or global scale. And so one reason a definition is hard is that as well our technological capabilities as societies are evolving. Advancements in anonymization and encryption that we've seen over the years, for instance, also play a role. So I think finding baseline understanding is a key part of today's topic of diplomacy for data, which I understand to cover the management of international relations as it pertains to data access and to use, which is at the core of the research profession. So I think there is an important distinction that can be made between like a potentially artificial construct of data security that's focused solely on location, which can sometimes be the case, and its ability to be accessed, and then perhaps a more substantive approach to the question based on the consideration of the protections that data enjoys in practice, and recognizing the importance of cybersecurity and operational safeguards, and then the safeguards provided by democratic societies with shared values accessing, or not accessing, but involved in as destinations for data, I guess, they're within their jurisdictions.
Really fascinating. Yeah, John, do you have any remarks?
Yeah, so within the context of supply chains and thinking about data challenges and opportunities, I think the primary challenge is the one I already alluded to, which is pretty much every supply chain is owned by the private sector. So information about those supply chains is only knowable to the extent that private sector firms involved in those supply chains choose to talk about them publicly, because they're under no obligation to describe, for example, how they go about making an airplane. So I'm based in Seattle, Washington. Boeing has factories in 50 plus countries, design teams in 50 plus countries. They're under no obligation to describe where they source the rubber that makes the wheels, where they source the printed circuit boards that go in the avionics, where they source the carbon fiber composites that make the wings. All of those supply chains are under the control of the company, and they have no commercial incentive to share that information. So for policymakers that are interested in assessing supply chain resilience and supply chain security, navigating a lack of data availability is really important, and figuring out what sources of information you can turn to that might provide sort of a proxy that you can use to assess a supply chain is very important. I think one opportunity that I see is, especially in light of the recent executive order I mentioned earlier, the US government's generated quite a bit of information on critical technology supply chains in recent years. And actually, the International Trade Administration is currently or recently solicited feedback on a proposed list of critical technology harmonized system codes. So codes that correspond to particular commodities that are deemed critical technology. So the government's paying a lot of attention to this, and they're doing so in a data-driven way. And I think the big opportunity is not losing that momentum in the medium term, because the temptation is to write a report once every 5 years on a subject and sort of walk away from it in the intervening time. But a lot of the information that's been generated will be more relevant and more impactful for policymakers as it's provided it is regularly updated.
Really great. Yeah, all these mentions about obligations or no obligations, jurisdictions, definitions, codes. Really great to hear about. So let's dive more into kind of the specifics of what your work entails. I'm really curious to ask, as a novice, reading up on data user agreements, but also as someone who handles a lot of other people's data, I'm really fascinated by this legal world that exists and kind of the rules with it. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPP, has been described as the most advanced model for electronic commerce so far. And the EU General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has been known to have heavy transnational obligations and scope and cross-border data transfers. So what opportunities and or barriers have you encountered in your work as it pertains to these large multilateral agreements? And how have you seen other data user agreements play a role? Likewise, how have domestic laws reacted to larger international data laws and multilateral agreements? So with that, I'll direct this question first to Hannah and then John and then Alma.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And just as a quick background, people might be familiar with it, but it's a comprehensive privacy legislation in the EU that applies across industry sectors and to companies of all sizes. In addition to the text of the GDPR itself, individual member states have guidance that they publish to help organizations operating in their territory comply with local GDPR data protection requirements. And the European Data Protection Board, that groups together all the member state data protection authorities, also publishes guidance meant to harmonize interpretation of the GDPR across the European Union. So for instance, the European Data Protection Board has guidelines with hypothetical examples that are meant to help organizations understand whether data processing falls within the scope of the General Data Protection Regulation. And I recognize that for organizations, there's a lot of information for them to monitor when crafting and updating their data governance and data privacy policies to comply with the GDPR. So this can also entail significant compliance costs. The EU-US data privacy framework that we administer at the International Trade Administration is aimed at providing an easier way for US firms, primarily SMEs, to receive EU personal data in compliance with EU law. And from a government perspective, the US Department of Commerce and the European Commission have crafted over the course of 2 years this EU-US data privacy framework to provide these companies with a future mechanism to comply with the GDPR requirements. And this has been a Biden administration priority from day one. On October 7th, 2022, President Biden issued an executive order called Enhancing Safeguards for United States Signals Intelligence Activities. And the Department of Justice issued accompanying regulations implementing the US commitments under the EU-US data privacy framework. So these changes to US law strengthen the privacy and civil liberties safeguards governing US signals intelligence activities, and they establish a multi-layered redress mechanism with an independent binding authority. And the EU-US data privacy framework will amend the current Privacy Shield framework principles, and this strengthens safeguards for signals intelligence activities, new redress mechanism, and updated privacy principles under the EU-US data privacy framework will form the basis for this future adequacy decision from the European Commission that I mentioned. And I'm using this as a case study to show the importance and work being done to restore stability to data flows, because it is an issue that thousands of EU and US firms rely on.
Thank you. What an interesting legal network. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so from the supply chain side of things, there's really not much to add. It's kind of the Wild West. There are no legal agreements. Again, all of these supply chains are managed by companies that participate in them. there are no international agreements. There's no standardized templates for supply chain mapping. There's no sorts of standardized fora where people get together to talk about data in the context of supply chains. It's all very ad hoc, and there's no real, I don't think, need or venue for more information sharing. Ultimately, supply chains are business to business transactions, and the only time the government seems to express a interest in learning more about a supply chain is when it is deemed critical or when there's a supply chain interruption. So having a proactive role and dealing with things at a scale equivalent to GDPR for supply chains is there's nothing like that out there.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I had no idea. Alma, go ahead if you have remarks.
Yeah, the GDPR is really the first kind of behemoth attempt to try to wrangle in some of the data privacy implications and governance. And it really set off a chain reaction where many other countries started adopting their own legislature around protecting data and giving citizens a mechanism to complain about some of these things. And I think that's something that's still really difficult to grapple with and to find enforcement around. And that's certainly something that I've seen in work looking at institutions, especially in the United States. I think we're still lacking so much of that comprehensive legislation. And, there are pockets where even state legislations, like California's legislation, don't apply, for example, on university campuses, or there's still a lot of gap where things need to be addressed. And something that I find really fascinating from the legislation approaches is the topic of national security, because that often creates a lot of exemptions. And I think it's worthwhile to investigate those exemptions and to kind of consider the boundaries of these legislations.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, it's really amazing to hear how connected but also reactive this legal field is around data. So likewise, I'm really curious to ask about data in a more social lens, especially because data has this fascinating trade law history associated with it, in addition to acting as carriers of values and identities when countries, organizations, and communities interpret data. So how has cultural diversity shaped your interactions with data governance, policy, and/or diplomacy? And I'll direct this question first to John, and then Alma, and then Hannah.
And I will quickly redirect it. I don't think I have a very good answer for you on that. Supply chain information is not much, it doesn't have much of cultural resonance and is not part of any cultural zeitgeist that I'm aware of. It is really just corporate transactions and business mapping and commodities.
I see. Now, this is all extremely interesting. Whether you say there's no cultural resonance or it's like the Wild West, you're really mapping a great picture of the work you're doing. If anyone like me had different assumptions. But yeah, go ahead, Alma, if you want to take on this question.
Sure. My master's thesis was looking at RFID implants and kind of the implications around that. And something that I found really fascinating was it's culturally accepted in Sweden, and it was like readily adopted, where people would have these parties of biohacking parties where they would inject themselves, like right here with RFID chips. And those RFID chips don't really do much. They kind of open doors and, but it was like this cool biohacking thing and gave people the opportunity to talk less and have very brief interactions. When they get on a train, they can just scan instead of having to talk to somebody. So there's definitely a societal and cultural shaping that comes with how people approach data governance and the extent to which they trust their governance, which is something in the United States that's very fractured, especially given after the Snowden leaks and kind of the understanding that citizens were being surveilled, even though they had no reasonable actions that would make them, that would warrant that surveillance. So yeah, that's kind of where I see some of that cultural influence.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's always interesting to see how people react to data in their communities, especially with these parties. Hannah, go ahead if you have remarks.
I had no idea about these parties. That's really a whole new world. Very interesting, Alma. Thanks for that. I was thinking about this in relation to commonalities between privacy laws across jurisdictions, and they often build from internationally recognized principles like the OECD privacy guidelines that were the first internationally agreed privacy principles. But I do think every country has its own approach that's influenced by its history and culture and also what its domestic legal framework is. And something that we also run at the International Trade Administration are the global cross-border privacy rules, the CBPRs, and it's a forum that's basically establishing a baseline of common standards across jurisdictions to bridge different approaches to facilitate cross-border transfers of personal data without requiring the identical legal framework in every jurisdiction. I think there's an important role as well that governments can play in explaining our work around data, both to citizens, but also to strategic partner nations, for instance, in the trade space. And a basic understanding of a country's history can help us understand why they have some of the laws that they have, particularly in the privacy space. So effective diplomacy can acknowledge that and build on this. And those were my thoughts on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting, especially with you, Hannah, hearing about you're very concerned with like definitions and standards. You're really trying to build this legal language all the time. So great. My final question for you all is kind of one that starts leaning more into critical technologies. We've been kind of mentioning it in the background. We all kind of know the technologies are some of the very things that collect and store data. So with big data, the Internet of Things, also known as IoTs, artificial intelligence and cloud computing, there are all these data tools and analyses that are creating disruptions in the data science and data governance fields. How have these novel data technologies or other novel data technologies impacted the data economy and data policies in your work? And what do you anticipate happening next? And I'll direct this question first to Elma and then Hannah and then John.
Yeah, this is right up my alley for what I'm looking into. It seems like these technologies have really pushed forward this open innovation concept. And I think on a broader international lens, there's kind of a competition mindset to who can, develop the best AI, who can, get there first. There's definitely that kind of mentality on a broad scale, but and it seeps down into some of the more local initiatives. And I think, given just this innovation mindset and this very shiny promise of like automated vehicles and self-driving vehicles and this very utopian technological dream that's being sold, it is really fascinating and great, but it lacks the understanding that people who are historically marginalized tend to then be once again marginalized by these new initiatives. And there's a lot of practicality that is ignored, and a lot of harm that's created in pursuit of these kind of sci-fi dreams. And I think something that I'm seeing the direction heading towards is a lot of pushback. And I think that's something that is unanticipated and For example, the Smart Streetlights project in San Diego, where they put up these streetlights that were said to just be sensing to turn on and off automatically, ended up having a lot of different capacities onto them, and surveillance, microphones, watching neighborhoods. That received significant pushback in the communities and was eventually forced to be turned off. So there's kind of this pushback that I think is going to become more and more prevalent as people realize their need to have their privacy protected more and more, and kind of depending on where they are and how their government is acting, it could be very oppressive very quickly. So that's kind of where I see things heading.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's almost as if there's very few safeguards with technology. It's all about, yeah, that big competition. Hannah, any remarks?
I was going to focus on the AI piece of the question and highlight some work that other parts of the Department of Commerce and the government are doing in this space that I think is relevant. So that within the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has developed a framework to better manage risks to individuals, organizations, and society associated with AI. This is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, and it's intended for voluntary use and to improve the ability to incorporate trustworthiness and considerations around trustworthiness into the design, development, use, and evaluation of AI products, services, and also AI systems. So it was released very recently on January 26th and was developed through a consensus model. So information, draft versions that were available for public comment, workshops, and other opportunities that that people had to provide feedback. So it's intended to build on, align, and support AI risk management efforts by others as well. And then the other area where I thought AI was worth noting is that the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, sorry for all the acronyms, this acronym is the TTC that you might have heard of. It was initiated with the European Commission under the Biden administration. And in the TTC, the Department of Commerce leads or co-leads on the US government side for 5 of 10 different TTC working groups. And the topics range from tech standards to secure supply chain, ICTS security. And then we work with our interagency colleagues, specifically the State Department and the United States Trade Representative on the other working groups that we don't lead. But within this whole set of working groups, we're also cooperating on standards more broadly. And so here specifically, as a result of the commitment made within the context of the TTC, on January 27th, the US and the European Union signed an administrative arrangement to bring together experts from across the US and Europe to further research on artificial intelligence, computing, and related privacy protecting technologies. So within this, my understanding is the 5 key focus areas for driving responsible advancements in AI are related to extreme weather and climate forecasting, emergency response management, health and medicine improvements, electric grid optimization, and then agriculture optimization.
Great, thank you. I definitely resonate, yeah, with that list. No, it's really great to hear about kind of like risk management as a solution, and even just increasing conversations. If you're not going to do it externally, it's great to do it internally. So I guess we'll end with John, unless last remark for this question.
Sure. Yeah. So within the context of the supply chain data world, the focus on critical technologies has mainly focused on defining the supply chains for how a critical technology comes to be. So to stick with the AI example that's been mentioned, a lot of the focus has been on the determinants of how you make AI, which is generally agreed to be some combination of well-structured data that you can train an algorithm on, and then talent, the physical workforce that's doing it, and then the hardware or the compute. So data, hardware, software, and talent are kind of the high-level supply chain buckets for how AI gets made. And that's indicative of the overall approach the supply chain world has taken to critical technologies, which is defining what constitutes a critical technology and then figuring out what value-added steps along the way ultimately result in the emerging or critical technology, whether it be small modular reactors or brain-computer interfaces.
Oh, thank you. Really great discussion overall. If anyone still also wants to tune in to respond to anything anyone has said, please feel free. This has been really eye-opening, and I'm really thankful for you being here today and sharing about your work. I'm going to open up the floor for any audience questions early, and then if there are no pressing questions, I'll ask one last final question. All right, we have one question so far. How does an institution or organization best balance the need for data security with data accessibility and usability? Anyone want to take this on? It's a classic question. There's always the accessibility versus security question.
I can try. I think this is something that every institution or organization needs to kind of grapple with it within their own culture and their own priority. I think it's hard to say this like a general answer around this, but I think it really it's a need to have a team or person that's really dedicated to finding solutions around this question within if they're creating technologies, to make sure there is a team dedicated looking at the social and ethical implications of the technology and looking at and they have a team that's looking at cybersecurity impacts and making sure that those things are taken care of up front. Because what I see a lot of the times is there's a cybersecurity incident and then there's kind of a fix, or there's kind of a really big impact that's detrimental to its community or customers or whoever is being subjected to, and then there's kind of an attempt to fix it, but there kind of needs to be an upfront innovation cycle or organizational structure that starts to think about these things upstreamed.
I'll ask a quick follow-up too, because Alma, you're more in the research world. I feel like cybersecurity, in order to like maybe build on the solutions you are addressing, do you feel like it needs to become more of like a research question, or is it more like a practical institutional tool, kind of like what Hannah's saying, like have your risk management unit?
Yeah, I think what Hannah brought up is kind of the way to start going about it. I think all of this needs to be down at a practical level. And I think, yeah, I am a PhD student, but I think my program is really oriented towards looking at things from a practical view as well. And yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to take this on, or any other questions?
I appreciated Elma's insights on this, and I don't think I have anything to add. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Well, I might just ask one last question. This again can be optional, just to conclude the meeting. So something that I think is being considered is that a more data-driven world has often been described as one that's more decentralized, because citizens, practitioners, and experts each own their own data and they generate their own data. How would you describe the state of data ownership and privacy in your work? Likewise, when has the provenance and trust around data been important conversations in maintaining data diplomatic relations? So anyone who wants to take this on, leave it open.
Sure, I'll take a crack at it initially. So the hard thing with supply chain related information is, in general, it is probably all public if you know where to look. But the value proposition that many companies have built a business model around is aggregating vast amounts of supply chain related information into well-organized, searchable, queryable, software as a service landing pages. And at that point, the data becomes private and is owned by those firms because they've paid the cost to aggregate and organize it and resell it, even though in theory, all of that information may be publicly available if you know what databases to be querying from certain government agencies and state and local agencies and things of that nature. It's data ownership is increasingly a challenge in supply chain security because of that.
Really interesting. Thank you, John. I guess if there are no other questions, there's one comment. Let me see. Okay, I'll read this out loud and see if anyone wants to take this on. So one comment / question asked was, am I correct to think that much of the work described in this webinar is a matter of turning away from formal treaties and conventions and working instead on building normative rules of behavior by consensus? Does this supplant strict legal approaches, and if so, should it? Or if you disagree, if you're like, no, it's the Wild West.
Yeah, I think this question is not super relevant to the supply chain world. I don't think there's much to say from my side.
Okay.
I think that there's a lot of effort, and I think Hannah really gave us an insight into a lot of the policies and regulations that are being made and frameworks that are being made to try and have some kind of mechanisms on a broader scale to look at how data is being governed. But I think for me and my perspective on it and my research, in lieu of having comprehensive regulations, and while we are really grappling with this very difficult and messy understanding of how do we do data governance and how do we do it right and how do we have all of the enforcement and mechanisms, like this is all still being really created in real time. So I think while that is still being grappled with, there's an obligation on kind of normative rules of behavior and legal approaches being supplemented by institutional policies, by kind of local level policies.
Yeah, thank you, Alma. All right. Well, if there are no other comments, I'm going to wrap up this great webinar. And so I want to give a great thank you to the speakers for participating in this event. They truly offered perspectives that I thought were nuanced, that were detailed, diverse in thought, diverse in background, and I'm grateful to have been able to work with you all. So now to wrap up the event, I want to say that this is one event of many. If you're curious to learn more about data diplomacy, we will have 2 more events in the series. And if this event, Diplomacy for Data, was especially inspiring, I really encourage audience members to reach out to our speakers for more questions and the NSPN team behind this event if you'd like to continue expanding the series with us. And so thank you all again for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.